Welcome to the 8th meeting of the Community Safety Advisory Commission. I was just doing some double checking. I think we're going to have several members not here today, somewhere around 4 or 5, and a couple of we just don't know. Can you turn this one down just so I can hear reverberation? Okay. So again, welcome. The first thing I need today would be the approval of the minutes. So moved. And second, any questions or concerns? Then all in favor of approving the minutes, please raise your hand. Thank you. Minutes are approved. So let me, and I'll use the term apology. I think at the last meeting I shared with you that I was going to send you the committee assignments. And then I made the decision that I'd rather do that today. And I'm going to wait until a little bit later in the meeting to see if some other folks come in, so I don't need to repeat it. But I have, we have made those decisions. And one of the other things we wanted to share is that, for example, with the training committee, we really don't want that committee to meet until we've actually covered training in this session. So the one that we know we can move forward with pretty quickly would be hiring. But the others may be delayed until we've actually covered the materials as a group with the commission, but I will share that. Structure of the meeting, Dr. Jones is going to bring us some very interesting information on 21st century policing. I believe you have the PowerPoint in front of you, and I will share with you, and I haven't read it, this is the full report from the President's task force, and I've started reading it, and it's very, very, very interesting. And on another note, I have a thank you to Dr. Jones, and I wish I could have been there for the entire 2 days. I think it was just last week that we had the TAPS training, 2 days out of the police academy. And Dr. Jones, would you like to share with us what TAPS stands for?
Yeah, that's the Teen and Police.
I'll repeat it. Oh, okay.
I didn't even have my shoes on. TAP stands for the Teen and Police Service Academy. So what we did was on Thursday and Friday of last week, we had a 2-day training, and we really just offered an opportunity for officers to talk about their youth interactions. Then we gave them training on youth interactions, and then we really did a training, and they got to do some role playing of the actual TAPS Academy. And so we taught them, how to de-escalate, how to do intervention, how to work with kids, understanding the teen brain. And it really was remarkable, the turnout, the engagement, and Ms. Jackson, she did attend for Friday, so she got to see part of it.
Yes. This program started in Houston. Columbus actually applied for funding, and we didn't get it. So we should be commended. The city should be commended, the police department, that they're moving forward without all of those resources. So I had the opportunity to meet one of the co-founders. But what's most impactful for me is that he started out, after some preliminary things about TAPS and his background, he had each officer in the room answer, it could have been a 3-part question, but this is what I remember specifically. What has been your most positive interaction with a juvenile? What has been your most negative interaction with a juvenile? And then the 3rd part was around kind of, your takeaways or what should be strategies. Now, many of them, when they introduced themselves, gave their precinct numbers, and I am afraid that I don't know where every precinct is. I got a general idea of that. And is this a volunteer situation? Must they volunteer to be a part of this program? A real varied group of officers, age, gender, race, lots of different experiences. A couple of them work in missing persons. There was a female officer, wherever she's currently working, it's in near an apartment complex where there are lots of kids, and now she's moving on. Heard a lot about, Heltonia, a lot, around London. But from each and every officer, as they talked, I could maybe gather, this is where they started, kind of like I'm in the cruiser, and I'm the officer, and you're going to obey me, to now how they really interact with young people, the things and this is before their training, maybe things that they learned, on their own. So there's the one officer who starts out every day with teddy bears in his cruiser, the officer who's switching precincts, popsicles. There were the two officers from missing persons, where they had actually found a young boy and had returned him home. And I'm not quite sure what led them to being in his bedroom, but they knew that he shared a bedroom with a brother, and when they looked in, there was just one twin bed, and it wasn't exactly a chair, but there was some piece of furniture, so they switched off who had a chance to sleep in the bed. There was no dresser or chest of drawers. The clothes were just in a pile. And from what I gathered, it was these two officers. Now, I don't know if they went back to missing persons somewhere else, but they garnered enough funds on their own to buy bunk beds and to completely outfit them, to get at least one chest of drawers. And they said as they looked around the house, they realized that there wasn't anything in that home to kind of keep the young person involved. So what they typically do is just go out on the streets. And so they bought them a flat screen TV, put it in the bedroom, and an Xbox. And they did that because they wanted to do it, not because it was part of any policy or practice. And I heard so many examples of that I left there. I really did wish I could have stayed for the whole training, but if nothing else, to hear from individual officers. We also had 3 guests, 3 or 4 Westerville officers who've heard about the program. And specifically, when you think about Westerville, there are children who live in the city of Columbus, but who go to school, in Westerville. I had the opportunity this week, because I don't know if Whitehall has ever participated, but I sent word to the city attorney of Whitehall that maybe he would want to look into this, because I think it would be a great experience for their officers also. So again, I want to thank Dr. Jones for inviting me, and if I have the chance to go for the entire 2 days, I will the next time around, because I just thought it was great. So after we hear from Dr. Jones on her presentation, and she's going to have to maybe close to 3 o'clock, because I've taken up some of her time. Pardon?
It might end a little bit before that. I gotta dip out.
Oh, okay. And then you can see we'll have a presentation by Sergeant Brophy on problem-oriented policing and Columbus's practices. Then we are going to have a group discussion about what we've heard. There may be some CPD updates, and then at the end I'll do some commission updates. And I should probably warn you that this is the last time I think we're going to have a 2-hour meeting, so enjoy it. Okay? All right. Dr. Jones?
I don't know how we're gonna do this with the mic and clicking. But I need it. Okay. You wanna click for me? He's gonna click for me. All right. See, my heels help. I can reach the mic now. All right, so last time we had a meeting, we talked about, there were some questions and concerns about what exactly 21st century policing is, and just other forms of policing and policing strategies. And so I was just asked to do an overview of policing. And so you all are going to be my class today, officers included. And I'm going to give you all a lesson in policing, okay? So you can go ahead. So first and foremost, I think it's important to understand the evolution of policing. So you may need to take some notes, okay, because I'm going to talk. I would write on the board, but I'm stuck to this microphone. So there are a couple of eras of policing that you should be familiar with. When we talk about policing, the first era is known as the political era. The political era lasted between 1840 and 1930. First era of policing, the political era, between 1840 and 1930. After that, we get to the reform era of policing. The reform era of policing is from 1930 to 1980. After the reform era of policing, policing from 1930 to 1980, we enter into an era of policing called community policing, the community era. That is from 1980 until about present. And I want to put a caveat on all of this, that even before we got to the political era of policing, we had the genesis of policing, and I have to make sure everybody is mindful of the framework that is rooted in what we know as slave patrols. So that kind of sets the framework for how policing has evolved over the years. So you have slave patrols, you have political era, you have reform era, you have the era of the community era. And then after that, in the community era, we get into these different types of strategies. One of the main strategies is proactive policing. Proactive policing, and I have the definition up on the board and it's in your PowerPoint, so I don't need to, regurgitate everything here, but it really is a strategy to policing that embraces everything that is created to reduce and or prevent some form of crime that is happening. So these are different strategies and techniques. They're not necessarily an isolated program, but multiple programs sort of working together. So if we look at proactive policing, I put together a little chart for you all in your pamphlet. There are different types. There's hotspots policing. There's problem-oriented policing. There's focused deterrence policing that really encompasses like the stop frisk. I'm sure most of you heard about that with New York and NYPD. And then you have your community-oriented policing. Now, if you look at the bottom of this chart, it has the type of intervention. So hotspots policing is place-based. It focuses on a particular area and deals with crime and deviance in a specific area. Problem-oriented policing deals with a specific type of crime, the issue. Focused deterrence focuses on the offender. It's a person intervention. And then when you get to community-oriented policing, that is a community-based intervention that really embraces law enforcement working together with the community and them working hand in hand in order to address and deal with crime and deviance. Everybody got that? And you kind of see the objectives and the key approaches in the chart. So after we have that, you can go ahead into the next one. We move to the era of what we are all in now, which is 21st century policing. Now, 21st century policing was really started when President Barack Obama, in December, he issued an executive order and he put together this task force. And it was of 11 individuals, and their goal was really to just look at policing, figure out how and what the future of policing is going to be. How can we learn from the past in order to improve our future? This was the result of several high-profile incidents that has taken place across the nation. We had Trayvon Martin in 2012, and then you get Mike Brown in August of 2014, and then that's when in December of 2014, you had the president issuing this executive order in order to establish this task force. So that's a little bit about that. You can go ahead. And this is a picture of everybody who was on the task force. So you should have that and all of their names. It was co-chaired by two individuals, Charles Ramsey, who was the commissioner for Philadelphia PD, and then also Lori Robinson, who is a professor at George Mason University. And then you have several individuals who actually served on the task force. Some of them are very well known, like Brian Stevenson. I'm sure, have any of you all read Just Mercy? It's a great book. Or, and what he has done is he started what is called the Equal Justice Initiative. And he really looks at individuals who are serving, who have death penalty sentences. And he's also funded, I'm not sure if you all heard, but there is a lynching museum actually in Alabama. He's actually funded that. So he's done a lot of innovative things. And then there are several other wonderful people on the task force. You can go ahead to the next slide. So the mission of the task force is this. Consistent with applicable law, what they're supposed to do is identify the best practices for law enforcement. And then once they identify the best practices, make recommendations to the president and other law enforcement communities about how to effectively reduce crime as well as build trust with the community. You can go to the next one. That's what the actual report looks like. I think it's like 116 pages. Did you hold the report up? It's huge. So if you have some time to read, you can read that. But I tried to condense all of the important stuff in your PowerPoint so you have like your little cheat sheet right there. So first thing is first, the task force established 6 pillars. Those 6 pillars include trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, as well as officer wellness and safety. And so what we'll do is take a little bit of time to go through each one of these, what some of the recommendations were, and then where do we go from here. So the first is looking at trust and legitimacy. One of the things that the task force recognized is that there are different segments of the population that have different and varying levels of trust with law enforcement across the country. Now, for this presentation, I didn't focus on Columbus. I looked at national data. So everybody get a context. This is national data. This is not specifically Columbus, Ohio. But they said that there is trust and legitimacy. And when people do not or have a lack of trust in the officers, in police, in law enforcement, then that kind of puts a tamper on legitimacy. So in order to improve legitimacy, you have to build trust with the community. So if you look at, you can go to the next slide here. If you look at this chart that I've included, the Gallup poll regularly does these public opinion surveys, self-reported surveys. They call people, they ask them questions. Every year, they conduct one on confidence in police. So what I've done is created two columns here looking from 2012 to 2014, as well as 2015 to 2017. And I broke the numbers down in terms of level of confidence of police. Now, this result is from a Gallup poll. They questioned about 1,009 individuals, the confidence levels and all of that checked out. And so what we see here is based on race and ethnicity, ideology, age, and party identification, there are various levels, varying levels of confidence in the police. So what the task force says is you have to look at and recognize that there are several historical issues that have contributed to the confidence in police. And so as we move to build trust and legitimacy, it's important to do that as well as acknowledge the past, understand that those may be some blocks and barriers, and figure out ways to overcome that in terms of building trust. You can go to the next slide. And then they also noted that one of the main primary ways of building trust and legitimacy with communities, especially the communities that law enforcement agencies are charged with protecting and serving, is procedural justice. Procedural justice focuses on transparency, accountability, community, and trust, all of that woven together. And there are four principles of procedural justice. Number one is making sure people are treated with dignity and respect. The other one is ensuring that individuals have a voice when they do have a police encounter. Instead of coming in an authoritative manner, hear both sides of the situation. Being neutral and transparent. That also addresses issues of accountability. And then the other one is conveying trustworthy incentives and motives and things like that. So it says if law enforcement agencies focus on being procedurally justice, this way, this improves legitimacy in lives of the community, and then that's how they can work hand in hand in terms of working together to solve crime. Then there are two other issues when we talk about procedurally just behavior that the commission talk about, but this is also my little caveat in terms of procedural justice. Procedural justice is internal as well as external, and it's important that we all know that and how that impacts law enforcement agencies and how they police the communities. Internal procedural justice refers to how officers perceive their leaders and their superior officers within the agency, whether they feel like they are treated with respect, whether they feel like they have a voice, because that in turn influences their interactions and their behaviors while they are out on the street. So you say you have to have internal procedural justice. External procedural justice refers to transparency, refers to the positive interactions that happen between individuals and law enforcement while they are out on the street. And those also translate into whether or not the community respects and trusts law enforcement agencies. You go to the next slide. So these are some recommendations. I'm not going to read them all verbatim. I'm kind of going to summarize them for all of you. You have your PowerPoint so you can read them. But many of the main recommendations focuses on officers really engaging in the community, understanding the history, adopting policies, being transparent in their behaviors and how they interact with the public. Also, promoting legitimacy internally within the law enforcement agencies. And then they also talk about promoting public safety, working hand in hand with the community. You can go to the next slide. And the other thing that they talk about in the report in terms of 21st century policing is that law enforcement agencies should understand that when new crime fighting strategies are implemented, what are the collateral consequences for the public? How does that impact the public? Is it going to have a positive impact or a negative impact? Is that going to elude trust or is that going to help trust? And so those are some of the things. And then also building trust with immigrant communities and understanding that it is important to have a diverse law enforcement agency to reflect the community. They talk a little bit about that. You can go to the next one. So the second pillar, policy and oversight. So when we talk about policy and oversight, 21st century policing really looks at use of force policies, looks at departmental policies, how those policies govern the behaviors of law enforcement agency and how those then translate onto when the officer is actually on the street. Do they do what the policy suggests or is there something else? And if they break policy, is there a consequence for that? If they break policy, if there's a consequence, is that information relayed to the public? Are we transparent in letting the public know these are, the consequences for when an officer doesn't follow policy and protocol, or if an officer is supported or something, it turns out that they were in the right, is that information also relayed? So policy and oversight is important. You can go to the next one. So they looked at recommendations. Many of these recommendations focus on cooperation and collaboration, understanding that there are accrediting bodies, seeing what those recommendations are, but also working with your community organizations, working with individuals in the community, working with scholars, working with academic institutions to actually establish and develop sound policies that govern the behavior of law enforcement agencies, and then evaluating those policies to see if they're working. And if they're not, going back, reevaluating those, making adjustments accordingly. And so then there are some of the other ones that also look at policies for training, look at policies for oversight, investigations, prosecution, use of force, really comprehensively exploring all of those. So 21st century kind of embraces a little bit of all of this. You can go to the next slide. And then here are some more policies and recommendations, understanding for those agencies that use stop and force, how that impacts the community, how the community may perceive it, how there may be a disparate impact on certain segments of the community. 21st century policing really says that officers and law enforcement agencies should explore that. And then if there is a disparate impact, then understanding what adjustments need to be made to really promote equality and equity amongst different segments of the population. And then here are some more. There were a lot of recommendations for policy and oversight. So these are some of the other ones. Understand the policies and establish policies about search and seizure, arrest. This was a biggie that was also noted, that when officers attempt to stop somebody, when they approach somebody, a big recommendation was it should be a mandate that officers identify themselves. That's one of the strong recommendations for 21st century policing as well. You can go to the next slide, and we don't have to go over this. So then the sixth pillar would be technology and social media. There are a lot of law enforcement agencies, and we know technology is consistently and constantly evolving. I don't know if you all heard, but I believe iPhone is about to launch their new one today. Am I the only one? He knows. See, it's my tech guy. Thank you. So they're supposed to be. So I'm sitting here. I was checking my phone because I want to see when it's released because I want to get the phone. But anyways, technology is constantly evolving, constantly improving, and they're actually also coming out with a new watch too. So I'm checking all this stuff. I'm excited if nobody else is. And so what law enforcement agencies need to be is up to date on technology in terms of new social media platforms, and then how to improve and enhance just the profession of policing. A big issue that was brought up in the task force and many of the studies concerning 21st century policing was actually body-worn cameras. Are there rules and regulations about body-worn cameras? What are the policies and the procedures pertaining to body-worn cameras? One of the recommendations was make it mandatory that when officers do stop somebody, that they turn on the body-worn cameras. And so, one of the things we can explore is, how that works here within the city of Columbus. I know our cameras, I think we go back, is it 30 or 60 seconds? 60 seconds, that's what I thought. And are there any consequences? That was another one that came up in the report. Are there consequences when officers fail to turn on the body-worn cameras? What does that do to the investigation process? What does that do to trust and legitimacy? So 21st Century says that when law enforcement agencies implement these new technologies, they need to take a comprehensive view at the impact and how this may influence. There was a study done in 2015, I believe, that actually looked at body-worn cameras. And it's also noted in the actual report as well. So they looked at, and it was a randomized control group. So for all you statistics folks, that means there were individuals that were selected, randomly placed in a control group, randomly placed in a treatment group. One had the body-worn cameras, one didn't. The individuals, all the officers who were in the body-worn cameras group, they had an 87% reduction in use of force incidents. And they had a 59% increase in confidence in their job. And so that shows the benefit of having body-worn cameras. It's not just a benefit to the public, but it can also benefit the officers. Why? Because you see the cameras and you understand, you see the footage, what actually happened in the incidents. Now, maybe from a certain angle, but then that's when it becomes critical, the policies. When should the officer cut it on? If the officer doesn't cut it on, how does that affect what the outcomes are? So that was a big one in terms of technology. This just talks about agencies and law enforcement agencies that actually use social media. There are many law enforcement agencies that may post people on social media, may ask for help in social media, may alert the community of different things using social media, and there is a benefit to that as well. You can go to the next slide. And so these were some of the recommendations. Many of them I had already talked about previously, but looking at the implementation of appropriate technology, how that influences the practice of law enforcement and how officers really interact with the community. And then the other one was not only do you implement the technologies, but then you research them and you actually execute best practices as it pertains, particularly to body-worn cameras. You can go to the next slide. And then these are more recommendations that really focus on policy, procedure, implementing technology at the federal, local, and state levels. So we've already talked about, it's a lot, but we've already talked about trust and legitimacy. We talked about, what else we talked about? Anybody remember? Social media and technology, policy and oversight. It's all right, I'll remind y'all. And y'all got the PowerPoint. I don't even got the PowerPoint in front of me. All right, the other one is community policing and crime reduction. So, can anybody tell me what you think community policing should be in a perfect world? Class. No, you can't use the notes. You're not supposed to use the notes.
You should be led and involves the community and not from creating space for them to show up, and we do a lot of that.
Okay.
I was just trying to catch myself up. So
No, you go ahead. You
on the note. But it's rooted and driven.
Should you speak into the microphone?
Thank you.
And again, it sounds so that we can hear you. So.
For sure. It's been a minute, so let me get back into my microphone.
She said,
Hi.
I'm back.
I'm back. And first, let me just say hi, officially. I have been on a 6 weeks self-care, vacation, staycation, journey of discovery around my health and how much I'm putting forth. Because when we do this work, we have to take care of ourselves to be whole in it. So I'm glad to be back.
Welcome
I am
back.
refreshed and rested. Self-care is a beautiful thing. Try some if you must. So I wanted to say that and give context to where I've been, but it involves community.
Right.
And it's led by the community. And so we oftentimes create spaces like these where we want to hear from them, but there's no next steps. And so community leads community policing, and the police are an equal partner at the table with us. but it is led by what equals seating community.
It's a good, great definition. Did you read that PowerPoint?
I know, I've been doing this thing a long time, baby.
I knew she was going to say that. Do you want to add to it? You raised your hand, asked if you could cheat.
Well, I just had a question. I had a question, though.
Okay. Questions are fine.
Well, because as I'm reading, it talks about in community policing that people are more likely to follow the law if they believe that the authority, the people who have the authority, are acting in their interest. But where does justice come into that? If the law is unjust, but the people who are in authority seem to be acting in their interest, maybe there are interests that they're not acting in, and then the law could be unjust in that situation. So
So you're saying then the officer is stuck in a position where they have to enforce an unjust law?
Well, that could be the case. That could be the case.
Okay.
But then whether the person who is under that authority chooses to follow it or not, based on the understanding or their perception that it is an unjust law.
Right.
And so how those two things reconcile.
And that is an interesting question, because that is then kind of where discretion comes in a little bit, right? And law enforcement officers tend to have a lot of discretion. Just today, today I had to do a lecture at Urbana University this morning, okay? And on Urbana, there is a 2-lane road, right? Oh, this is being recorded. So anyways, I did a little speeding. Anyways, if I was to be pulled over by an officer, hopefully I could just cry my way out of it, but it would be the officer's discretion to determine whether or not he was going to enforce the law and give me a ticket for going like 95, or if he was just going to say, hey, you know what? We understand you got to get back to Franklin University. Go ahead. Have a great day, right? But that's discretion.
Warning to try to keep it within the speed limit going forward.
Yeah,
It's
with the
always a part of
warning.
that.
You always got to add the warning. You always got to add the warning, right? Follow the speed limit. But officers, they do have a lot of discretion. But then this taps into some of the more broader issues with the criminal justice system, because we know all laws are not just, and we know some disproportionately impact segments of the community, and we know for a fact we have a historical reputation of the criminal justice system not being perfect. And so that's when all of those factors kind of intersect, and then the officer has to make better judgment. How does the officer make better judgment? Well, who are we selecting to become our officers? How are we training our officers? What are the values that are being promoted by the law enforcement agency that they work for? And then, where does just personal morals come in play right there? So all of those factors. So you touched on a very broad issue. Yes.
In that context, a lot of what my experience and what most experiences are, they start out rooted in a lot of power over. In communities that have had to survive, and there's a lot of survival happening in most low-income communities that are policed the most. And so when you come in to exert power over, because we're all powerful, and so the police have a lot of power, but the people have power. And so until we recognize that as we start, most people, and I know from my experiences interacting with police, it comes from my humanness first, recognize I'm a human being and you are, and then let's get to how do we resolve it.
Well, it's so funny you mentioned that, because I included this quote here on the bottom of this, and I don't know if you can see it because I made it very small, but it says, officers enforce the law with the people, not just on the people. And I think that is very critical, that that message is promoted through law enforcement agencies, that it's not a us versus them, but it is a we. And so that philosophy, though, is a top-down philosophy that has to be promoted within law enforcement agencies. That's another thing that 21st Century says, that we have to adopt that we mentality, especially when we talk about community policing and how that may lead to crime reduction. Yes.
I just have a comment, and I was fortunate enough to have a ride along this past Monday on second shift. And it was the district in which I live and work, so it was pretty meaningful to me. And so when I see community policing and crime reduction, I want to give some very specific examples and recognition to this officer who took me around. So the initial call that we took was not to what we ultimately did, and that was she recognized a woman who was severely intoxicated and was in need of assistance, and we stopped and picked her up. And this officer treated her with a great sense of respect and dignity and was able to encourage the woman who absolutely knew this officer. I mean, there was a relationship there. And we took her to a service on Alum Creek Drive. I forgot where the officers take these. Where is it? What, yeah, it was Mary Haven, and she was good with that, and the individuals who worked there also knew the officers, so that was a very positive outcome in which this woman wanted to receive the services and trusted the officer. Another run that we went on was in picking up a kid who was suicidal at St. Stephen's, and so the mother absolutely did not want to come and work with these staff members at St. Stephen's, so we took the kid to Nationwide Children's Hospital. And so it was at that point, is Children's Services going to be called, or are we going to talk to the mom? And so this officer actually called the mom and said, listen, we have your son here, he needs your assistance. Do you need a ride to the hospital? Because we will absolutely pick you up and take you to the hospital and do what we can do to assist you. That was another intervention in which the mom said, you know what, I do have a resource to take me, I will be there, and mom came. And there was a bunch, but then the other impactful situation to me was a family that the officers in the district knew who recently experienced the death of their 4-year-old, cancer. And they were intimately involved with the family in a positive way, and so the officers took up some collection to get gift cards, stuffed animals for the kids, and we went to the family's home to intervene with them, discuss with them, and give this to them and express, you know, a kind of like a grief counseling to them and whatever else they needed. And so, again, I was impressed with that. And then finally, this officer, we stopped at this one corner where these kids were, and she had stickers. And so she kind of talked with the kids about what they learned in school, what do they do, what was happening, here's a sticker for you, tell me what you learned, here's a sticker for you. And actually parents came and talked to this officer in the cruiser. So there were a variety of things that were not staged, but was a very integral part in what this officer did, in addition to responding to some pretty significant calls that night. So I experienced, with this one officer, what I would say meets the definition of community policing, and so she should be recognized for that.
Well, thanks for recognizing
Yeah.
her. And
Yeah.
that is community policing, because there is not one standardized way, shape, form of community policing. Those are good examples. I'm glad you had that. My ride along, they were killing and shooting folks and stuff. So, I mean, you had
Want to share, but what neighborhood were you?
We were around, so the substation is 11 and 12 on Main Street.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's Children's Hospital and that,
Okay.
you know, that
Yeah.
area in there.
Let me share also, because Tammy, you weren't here when I talked about this at the very beginning. I had the opportunity last week, because Dr. Jones invited me to go to training for the TAPS program, and so this is, and I think you know about it. I don't know if there are 30 officers there, and again, very diverse, but what I was sharing with you, whether it's the teddy bear or the popsicles, of learning how to appropriately intervene. And we're going to have a session on training, specifically for juveniles. But I do recall that the co-founder out of Houston several times referenced that when he went through training way back when, it was kind of command and control. That's how they were taught, especially with juveniles. You know, your raised voice, command and control. And yet what the officers shared, and again, I'm not saying that's what Columbus is, because we're going to find out about that, but that what they have learned is that you need to be able to begin that communication, whether it's with an item or whatever, but the loud voice, you know, usually doesn't get it. And the officers that were in this program were from London, if I say Hiltonia, is that, because I said the hilltop. What is Hiltonia? Is that a specific area? Well, I thought it was a middle school, but it seemed to me as if they were referencing the neighborhood. Okay, well, I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
But they were from these very, very different areas. They were from some of the neighborhoods that I know have been identified as being very, very challenging. and some of the same, type of experiences. Dr. Jones, would you like to continue, please? Could we let her?
Dr. Jones, can I just say before we move on, because I just want to say this, and y'all know I'm back, so I'm going to try not to be talking too much, but I did a lot of years in retail as a manager trainer for Lady Foot Locker when I came home from prison. And there's such a thing as a secret shopper. Y'all all have heard of that. And so think about a secret shopper. We, as manager trainers, knew the secret shopper was coming. You think the corporate office didn't tell us? And so I don't want to take away from your experience at all. Because I'm from here, y'all know that. My last experience with police recently in my city that I love was at the Ohio State Fair with the State Highway Patrol and Columbus Police that was snatching kids up like they was, I don't know. It was so traumatizing again to me to watch how we did those kids at the fair, the last day of the fair in this city. In Linden, the same neighborhoods that we talking about. I watched kids being snatched up without their parents so much, I asked for the State Highway Patrol's officer, sergeant, captain's name. So there are different experiences, period, always. And I know I'm hearing, and I know that we are trying, let me not lose sight of that, to get to community policing. I know we are.
Yeah, and I was actually going
But
to touch on that a little bit,
Acknowledge that there are different experiences. If not, we wouldn't be here doing this. And so just as there are officers who don't engage in that type of positive behavior, there are officers that every day that do, and there are white officers and black officers, who necessarily do both. So it's not just one story. No one is saying that. So there are going to be the negative pieces, but one of the things that we also need to hear are the positive ones. It's some of both. It has to be balanced as we go forward. But again, just because we're sharing some of the positives doesn't mean we're trying to sugarcoat, and it doesn't mean that we don't fully acknowledge there's some bad things that happen out there. Okay?
Yeah, and
I don't want us to lose sight, because I'm getting old, that we are here to acknowledge that we have to address this issue of how we get to change.
And so one of the things in 21st century policing, it actually does recognize that. So it says, even though you do have good experiences with some officers, how then do you get the bad officers, per se, to do more of the good, or do you just get rid of them? Is it more training? Is it the quality of training? How do you address that? So 21st century policing says that there needs to be mechanisms in place to control and to check for that. So when we talk about, oh, you done skipped me up? Okay, so that was that. No, that's fine. So that goes to training and education. And so that is where training and education is critical. Here in the state of Ohio, we have a certain required hours of training that all law enforcement agencies are required to have. We had the session, I believe, that was on that said our officers, get more training than what is required. Well, 21st century policing looks at not the hours of the training, but the quality of the training. And that is where it makes a difference between a well-trained police officer versus one who is not so well-trained. And so you have to look at, are they trained to interact with youth? What does that training look like? What types of evaluation mechanisms are in place to ensure that officers are trained? Are we giving officers pre-test and post-test to see, did you actually learn something from sitting here all day from this training? And so then what 21st century policing also suggests is that law enforcement agencies need to partner with academic institutions. Law enforcement agencies are good at enforcing law. They are good at being a practitioner, but what they are not so good at is evaluation. And that is where a university, an institution, somebody who is trained in rigorous research methods and evaluation needs to partner to assess the quality of the training, and then also to use best practices in those trainings. And if there are issues, if there needs to be areas of adjustment, then go back, reevaluate, and make adjustments where necessary. So that is that. And then this looks at this chart, and we don't have to go over it really in detail, but what it has is the college degree requirements for full-time instructors at state-level law enforcement agencies, state and local law enforcement agencies, and this is across the country. You can go to the next one. So some of the recommendations are the ones that I just said, looking at the quality of the training, making sure we're using best practices, partnering with educational institutions to actually develop and to evaluate the types of training that is in place. And I think that's, and then the other recommendations for training, I sort of abbreviated these, but 21st Century Policing says in order to have a really good, effective law enforcement agencies, these should be mandatory. CIT training, that's crisis intervention training, not just making sure that it's there, but what is the quality of that training as well. Lessons to improve social interactions. One of the things that I didn't put on here, but in my talks that I do in other places about law enforcement agencies and just engaging the public, is talking about the ability to embrace what we call a sanctity of life philosophy. And so the sanctity of life philosophy is a philosophy that is promoted top down from law enforcement agencies that it really address use of force, that guides training, that says when you interact with another person, are you seeing them as a bad guy? Are you seeing them as an offender? Or are you seeing them as a person? And if you're seeing them as a person, then how would you interact with them? So that sanctity of life philosophy is important. Disease and addiction training. The other big one that is talked about in 21st Century Policing is making sure that there is mandatory implicit bias, not just training, but understanding how to deal with those implicit biases that individuals may bring, because we all have them. We all bring them into our respective careers and interactions with other people. But then once you do have them and you acknowledge them, what do you do with them? And then the other one is incentivizing higher education. Studies after studies have shown that when officers actually have a college degree, they have less use of force issues, they have less complaints, and so promoting higher education and incentivizing that. So having law enforcement agencies provide like compensation for students who go to school or police officers who go to school. And I believe we actually do that here for the city of Columbus. And as a matter of fact, we have a partnership with Franklin University where we give them a discount for going to school. So they get tuition reimbursement plus a discount. So making sure we promote more things like that. And Commander Meter is actually one of our instructors. He's teaching class right now. And then lastly, before I get out of here, the big one is officer wellness and safety. And not just understanding and promoting safety, but also promoting officer wellness. Officers engage and deal with, and they are exposed to a lot. Oftentimes they're the first responders. Oftentimes they see a lot of traumatic events. Understanding how to deal with that. So understanding spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, officer wellness, and actually implementing programs and things within law enforcement agencies to require officers to engage in mechanisms that promote officer wellness and safety. Just a couple of minutes, a day of mindfulness, that would make a difference. So this was another biggie. So the other thing is, that we talked about is with officer wellness and safety. I wanted to put this on here, and this is also talked about and discussed. I think they have an older chart actually in the actual report, but officer fatalities and the causes of that, how officer wellness and safety could lead to some of these fatalities. So in 2017, we had about 128 officer fatalities across the country. The number one cause, I believe, was traffic stops, and then after that, it was gunshots. And so what are the reasons for that? But there was another one that was a biggie, that it was officer sickness, like a heart attack on the job, was another big cause for officers dying while they work. And so implementing measures to require officers, if they're involved in, a shooting or something like that, making sure that they take out time, make sure that there's mandatory counseling in place, and then dealing with the other issues. And so the other thing that I want to put this in context, though, too, is when officers are burned out and they're still out on the street, and we had, there's a national situation with the lady working 12 hours a day and going home and mistaking the apartment and shooting somebody. When we look at the totality, we have officers, when they're tired and burnt out, they put their lives in jeopardy, but they also put the community's lives in jeopardy as well. Last year alone, we had 987 people who were shot by the police. 223 of those were African Americans. And so when officers are not well, then they're not able to do their job well. So we have to make sure that law enforcement agencies promote officer wellness and safety. Those were all of the recommendations, many of them that I just talked about, that are listed here. And that's that. Thank you.
Dr. Jones has to leave. Am I correct? So you have to leave. We're going to take a break. But again, for those who maybe came in a little bit later, this is the full 21st century report, from the President's Task Force that, no, I haven't read it all. Pardon?
One copy,
No,
or
this
we
is one
have
copy. This is one copy, not two-sided, single-sided.
Single-sided.
But it is. It's about 112 pages. But this has been a fabulous synopsis of what I think is going to be contained in this document. So we are going to take a 10-minute break, okay? While we're waiting for Tammy to rejoin us, you were given at your place the tentative future meeting timeline. So again, I want to say tentative, but I've already talked to Elon about one thing, because I'm concerned about our being able to get all of this work done. So this is tentative, but I've suggested to him that we look at another meeting in November, definitely before Thanksgiving, and the dates that will just be sent out, for you to be polled on would be the 15th and 19th. So again, a poll's going to go out. Denise had sent me a request about December, and even though it says early December, I think the first date I gave, was it the 12th? It's somewhere in the middle of the month, because I'm currently planning on being out of the city for at least a week. So just so you can have some, and I'm really cognizant, and one of the things that I said to her in terms of after Thanksgiving in December, we'll try not to have any meetings that go beyond 5 o'clock, because I know that regardless of where you work and what you do, social activities begin to have more of them because of the holiday season, and we'll try to stay away from that. So again, it is tentative. Before we end today, again, I'm going to talk about the committees and who's going to be on the committees. And for commissioners who weren't at the last meeting, I'll fill you in, on that. But if you look at your minutes, they're in front of you from the last meeting. I suggest you just take a peek. There's a thing in there that gives you the chairs and vice chairs. And then it talked about in the minutes from the last meeting. And I think also that we had this sort of round table discussion, and then people were able to share with me which committee they would prefer to go over. So I'll share that a little bit later in the meeting today. But we're going to continue our meeting today with Sergeant Fred Brophy. Some of you, I don't know if you were all there, I heard from the sergeant when, was it sort of an update that the mayor had out?
That was the Community Policing Initiative press conference back in July.
That's right, over on the west side. And so I heard a lot about what's going on in your part of town and everything. But welcome to our meeting today, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, so I think Dr. Jones did a fantastic job of outlining what are the theoretical aspects of 21st century policing is. So why don't we transition from theoretical and academic, and let's take a look at how the rubber meets the road, or the practical application of how some of these policing techniques have been implemented, in particular by the Columbus Division of Police this summer. So when we look at traditional policing, we oftentimes look at what we call the standard model of policing. The standard model of policing is centered around that rapid response of officers responding to crimes in progress or calls for service to get there as fast as possible to either apprehend suspects or to begin or initiate investigations of the crimes that have occurred, and then that's followed up with investigatory examination of what occurred, how can we prosecute. So that's what we call the standard model of policing. It is 911 calls for service driven. The problem is when, as academians, we look at those type of things, there is no empirical support that actually reduces crime, disorder, and fear in communities. All right. So then what we need to do is then we start to have to look, well, how can we have how can we affect those things, crime, disorder, and fear within our communities? How can we as law enforcement better serve our communities? So adding officers isn't necessarily always going to be a solution to it. Increasing random patrols isn't necessarily always going to do that. And then increasing our investigations isn't always going to do those things. So now we need to look at maybe like the next step. Where can we go with that? What I will say is that community-orientated policing, we've heard a lot of that since the 1980s. But that is a concept. It's not really a plan. It's not a plan of action for us as in law enforcement to say, okay, you're going to engage in community-oriented policing and that's going to reduce crime. As a law enforcement officer, as a frontline supervisor, that's a plan. That's a concept, or that's a concept that's not a plan. How do I do that? How does that work? How do I make that real within the communities that I work and I serve with? So looking at that, and I'm a little bit of an academician myself. I love to study these things. I want to give the city their money's worth for the $30,000 they invested in my master's degree. So I kind of delved into some of these things. Well, how could that work? And then I had the fantastic opportunity of this summer being allowed to supervise one of the three Safe Streets teams that the city has fielded in three specific neighborhoods. One was Linden, the Parsons Avenue corridor, and then I had the team that was responsible for the Hilltop West Side, Franklinton and the Hilltop. So, and my mandate that I was given is you need to then utilize your officers. We want this to be primarily bicycle patrols, which is great. I love bicycle patrol. I'm the lead instructor for a bicycle school, so that's right in my wheelhouse. And we want officers to focus on three things in particular, based upon surveys and examining 311 service calls from the city call center. In the Hilltop neighborhood in particular, their primary concern was violent crime, as it should be, because violent crime is bad there. Narcotics, trafficking, and prostitution. So when going into it, I knew a few things. First, my goal is to focus on those three things in particular, utilize my bicycle officers as the tool to do so, and then third, and probably most importantly, is to have a strong community engagement so that I could focus and direct the officers' attentions towards those things that the community specifically sees as crime problems. That's very easy for us to do when we have removed ourselves from the fortress or the castle of the cruiser and put ourselves onto a bicycle. We are now so much more approachable and so much more able to communicate directly, one-on-one with the citizens that are within our community. We don't just drive by at 35 miles an hour. We pedal by at 7 to 10. Much easier to get our attention. It's also much easier for us to hear, smell, see, and get a better grasp of what the actual dynamics of our community that we are policing actually is. It was interesting because as my officers were given the task to begin this project back in May, I was still teaching one of our basic bike schools. So I had a meeting with my officers that said, look, this is what I need you to do. First thing we need to do is identify what our citizens think are the problems. And it was fantastic because I have a very good team of officers that took the initiative. They went out and within 1 week had 37 specific crime complaints, both with looking at where it's occurring at, who our suspects are, but most importantly, how through direct contact, through direct conversations with our citizens, how that affects their neighborhood, how that affects their perceptions of safety, how that affects the crime rate. So what I did on that number 2 week is then I started to take a look at our graphic interfacing software. I take a look at the crime mapping. And crime mapping is a little bit of an art. It's not necessarily so much a science because we need to make sure that we're missing outliers. So if we look at too short of a time span, what we end up doing is we see spikes, but we don't see overall trends. The one thing that I do know, and I did know that I needed to focus in on, was identifying exactly geographically where the biggest problems within Hilltop and the West Franklinton area was. So when I combined those heat maps, the graphic interfacing heat maps, and I brought a couple of it, I want to pass them around and just take a look to see what they look like. And this is basically what a heat map is going to end up looking like. It's going to show us where the focus of certain Category 1 crimes are, the most violent crimes, or the violent crimes that we were tasked with are occurring at. And if you'll notice when you look at these maps, there are vast portions of the Hilltop that report little to no crime. And there are small, very segmented portions that actually report high levels of crime. So what we did is we kind of connected the dots between the community interactions that we had and then the crime graphic software, getting hotspots. And it's interesting because the same places that our citizens were complaining about the most as being problematic locations were also our hotspots on the crime maps. So what does that mean to us? What do we then need to do? Well, that's where the problem-oriented policing comes in. Problem-oriented policing means that we need to look at coming up with holistic solutions to the problem. I know that we cannot arrest our way out of a crime problem. We have to address the underlying causes of some of those crimes. Many of those causes, however, that we in law enforcement may not be able to answer. I cannot provide jobs. I cannot provide better education. I cannot always remove the trash from the streets that's been dumped down in the alleys. I know that those are the things I can't do. But do I know the people that handle those things? Yes, I do. All right, but more importantly, what we need to do is make sure that the policing is addressing those underlying causes of the disorder and crime to increase overall sense of safety within the community, and then pulling in all of those other city resources to focus in on addressing the underlying problems. So I'll talk about two particular incidences where we put all of those things into play. We put it all in action. One of those maps is going to show a hotspot at 2500 Sullivan Avenue. 2500 Sullivan Avenue is Roscoe's Carryout. Now, if you drive the Sullivan Avenue corridor, you'll notice that there are a lot of vacant buildings. There's a lot of businesses that have closed down or shuttered up, and it's a blighted community in a lot of respects. So when you look at the businesses that are open, are they contributing to order within that neighborhood, or are they contributing to the disorder of the neighborhood? Are they epicenters of criminal activity? Roscoe's was an epicenter of criminal activity. So what we found out is we made a couple narcotics arrests on the parking lot. We do some investigation. We do some interviewing with them. We find out that there was a nexus between both trafficking of guns and narcotics with a food truck that was running off of Roscoe's parking lot with the permission of the owners of the establishment. The parking lot was overgrown with grass. There was litter all over the place. Their street lights weren't working. This is what we call a crime nexus. Every piece of disorder that there could be at a functioning business was there to increase the overall ability for crime to occur there. There's a lack of ownership by the owners of the business. There's a lack of being a good citizen. So our team, again, we continued to make sure that we did aggressive. We did very proactive policing within that one block area of that location. We identified who the individuals were that were responsible for most of the drug trafficking. And then we teamed up with the nuisance abatement group headed by the city attorney's office, who came in. So we brought code enforcement. We brought the liquor enforcement agency, so Ohio Enforcement Agency. We brought the fire department in. We did an all-encompassing inspection of this particular business. We put them on notice. You need to repair these things so that you can continue to be a functioning member of this community as a business. The last thing, it would have been very, very easy for us to focus our attentions on closing this place down. Pull their liquor permit, pull all their permits and say, you need to close down. But what would that have done? That would have, again, precipitated more disorder, just one more blighted piece of property on the Sullivan Avenue corridor. Does that help increase the order and safety of the community? It doesn't. So we got all of that put into place. Now what we have is the food truck was removed. The parking lot is clean. Their lights are fixed. They make sure that their building is painted. The fire hazard of a trailer that was sitting immediately adjacent to the business was removed. And now whenever I go in and talk to the owner of that business, I'm like, hey, the trash is building up out front. He walks outside and he starts picking up the trash. It now is a safe place. And if you do a crime map on it, months later, the epicenter of crime, that red, is no longer there. I wouldn't say it has shifted, but it is kind of dispersed. So now what we don't have is that one location that creates a problem. Now what we have is a location that is a better neighbor to the community. Immediately across the street, a new food truck had moved in. So now we have, which is actually a thriving business now in Sullivan Avenue corridor. It always has patrons over there, purchasing food. They can do that because people are no longer afraid to stand at that street corner to make a purchase for food. Again, we're bringing order back into the community. And then we start talking to a lot of the neighbors that were within 1-2 blocks of this particular building, and they say, and this would be our metric of success, is they feel safer in their community because the dynamics of it has changed. They no longer fear going down to the corner and purchasing something at the store. They no longer fear driving through that particular section of Sullivan Avenue thinking that they're going to get robbed as they had previous to that. What that is an example of what we call hotspot policing, where we focus our attentions on those crime nexus locations. Vast majorities of crimes occur at specific locations. So when we look at it, calls for service, places of arrest, there are locations geographically within the city, and many people do a lot of research on this that shows if you focus on the areas that precipitate the crime, you will decrease the crime in those areas, and it's not necessarily always displaced. What you end up with is a positive diffusion, which means that the areas immediately adjacent to it, even though you didn't necessarily focus on that nexus there, of a whole block, but that whole block will gain the benefits of the proactive policing at that one location. It's a diffusion of positive enforcement as opposed to a dispersal or a displacement of crime to a different location. So piece by piece, we've attempted to do that at several different locations in that Sullivan Avenue corridor, which is really one of our most challenging areas out on the hilltop. Another area of problem-oriented policing focuses on people who have the highest criminogenic propensities. Vast majorities of crimes are committed by individuals. Specific individuals. You talk to many different victims, they will tell you that certain people just commit have higher probabilities of committing crimes. Since I gave this first speech back in July, there's been a lot of things that has changed in what we've done. Yes, sir.
Can you clarify a little more about how do you determine who the certain people are?
Look, I'm going to give that right now. So. Down at Sullivan Garden Apartments, 1440 West Rich Street, a couple of our officers started working both with the property management company and with the citizens that were inside there. If anybody's familiar with that piece of property, that is a very troubled piece of property. And if you look at my crime map, it is bright red. So we went down, the officers went down, they were talking with the property management. They started talking with a lot of the residents within these apartments. One of these apartments had just recently caught on fire, was almost burnt to the ground. A lot of people were displaced and made homeless because of it. The apartment complex rents to low rent individuals. Everybody in there pretty much is subsidized rent, which unfortunately also brings a higher probability of being crime victims. That's just an unfortunate side effect of living in those type of neighborhoods. So we started talking to everybody that was in there, and every resident ended up pointing to two particular individuals, Philly and Smoot. Philly and Smoot didn't live there. The property management had tried to run them off, and every time that they'd run them off, these two individuals would continuously come back. They would come back, they would sit up in the hallways, they were dealing drugs. They were actually bullying and moving in on a couple of different residents that were inside the apartment complex. The complex didn't know what to do with these two individuals. So and then we started talking to individuals, just having contacts. Again, we're riding our bicycles around, stopping and talking, and people were always down at the Marathon station at Sullivan Central saying, Philly and Smoot robbed me of my paycheck again last night. Philly and Smoot just stole my car. So this is how we kind of identified who it is that we need to focus in on. The neighborhood was telling us who we need to pay attention to. And eventually what we ended up doing is we worked with the property management company. We issued those two individuals trespass orders for the property, saying you're no longer welcome to be here. When they were in the hallway, 1441 West Rich Street, where they had been given prior notice that they weren't allowed to be at, they were arrested. They were in possession of two guns. They were using those two guns to rob the people over at the Certified. So that's how we kind of identify. We allowed the community to tell us who in your community is causing your problems and why is that a problem. All right, so we removed those two individuals from that location, and now, of course, they're tied up in the court system. We don't know exactly how that's going to be adjudicated. The upside to that is that the crime rates, the robberies at that particular location have bottomed out. And then they are now in the process of renegotiating the property management is in the process of renegotiating their contract with local housing agencies to provide more housing in new buildings because now they feel safe that they have a good working relationship with us to provide a safe environment, to provide low-income housing for people who are at need. In particular, because of their close proximity to net care, people are in need with mental health issues that need places to stay. All right, so that's really how we identified them. We need to avoid sometimes saying, I think you're a bad person, so that's who I'm going to focus on. And the beauty of problem-oriented policing is allowing the community to say, these are the people and these are the reasons we're having issues with them. Does that answer your
I
question?
guess so what you meant when you were saying that, you were talking about Philly and Smoot, those two.
So that's how we identified at that particular location our problematic individuals, the ones that were committed a disproportionate amount of crime compared to the rest of the population. Yes.
Point, because I've got, and I don't know, are you at the place where we're ready to interject or take questions or comments or concerns about some of that?
Let me just wrap up, all right? And then I'll
Okay.
I'm
wait till you
here
finish
as long
wrapping
as you
up.
need me to answer questions, okay? So the two things go hand in hand when it comes to problem-oriented policing. It is an identification of problematic people and problematic locations to better focus policing attention, but it is also a hand-in-hand interaction with making sure that we're engaging the citizens to find out and metering and measuring what it is that they consider to be their crime problem or their concern in their neighborhood. Now, I don't live in the neighborhood. In a lot of respects, I'm a visitor because I go to work there, but that doesn't mean that I don't see myself as a community member. I understand that I have to be able to see myself and engage myself as a community member in the greater Hilltop community because that's the area I work. That's the citizens that I choose because I can choose which side of the city I want to work on. I choose to work with, to engage in and provide good, high-quality policing. And it's above and beyond, the beautiful thing we had this summer is to go above and beyond the calls for service. I didn't have to wait for somebody to call 911 to go ahead and direct myself or my officer's actions. And I will say this, I had a little bit of an advantage. Prior to getting promoted 2 years ago, I spent 4 years as a high school resource officer at West High School. I know the community members. I had a hand in with many of the people on the Hilltop. Just about every family member on the Hilltop knows who I am and has my phone number. They know how to call me, so that then we can engage in and then engage all the police resources on a proactive level to respond to their concerns specifically, and then in general, as is needed. So that's kind of how we've taken the idea of using, and it's a combination of a few things you notice from the 21st century. What we're using, I'm using the education the city purchased, all right? We're using technology to better fine-tune exactly where those problem locations that we need to engage our resources at, and we're using that community engagement, that community relationship to go in there and again, identify what the problems that the community has, and then working within the community and the greater resources that the city of Columbus has to address some of those underlying problems. Now, the thing is I will say this, it's a work in progress. We've been doing this since May. I interview a lot, I talk to a lot of citizens. I talked to one earlier today. They still feel like their state neighborhood is safer, but it's still a work in progress. All right, there still are street lights out on Sullivan Avenue. There still are vacant businesses. There still is a trash problem in the alleys. And so what I can say is the work is almost monumental at sometimes. It feels overwhelming, but at the same time, when we as police officers have that ability to talk to citizens and say, we think things are we're heading in the right direction, we think things are getting better, that motivates us and drives us to continue that service the next day so that we can continue to work hand in hand to make it better, make it long term, and understand that this is a marathon, this is not a race, and that we're going to have to look at these things in long term and continue to work day after day after day until we meet that final goal at the end, which is safe, functioning societies in which our children can go to school, our children can learn, our citizens can have jobs, and we have the infrastructure in place so that we bring the American dream to every person that lives in every community, regardless of where it's situated, regardless of what its composition is in the city. All right, so that's how we have put the rubber to the road on problem-oriented policing with Columbus. So, questions I can answer, and if you want to wait for the forum for later, I'm going to stay as long as necessary.
So can y'all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I took some notes and I'm writing, but there's a couple questions. Some I have for you, but others for Officer I know you got promoted, Officer Meter. What? Captain, Sergeant, Commander? I forgot. Officer Meter. So to bring context, Officer Meter and I went on a journey together. Several years ago, I chaired the OSU Youth Violence Advisory Board. We looked at community policing from two lenses. Officer Meter and I went on a path to replicate, through funding from the U.S. Attorney General's office, Chicago ceasefire, which is now Cure Violence. I don't know how much the people in this room understand. I've done a lot of work in this area, so that's why I'm like just bubbling over here and taking notes. We sat on the committee together, didn't we, Officer Meter? We went to Chicago. We did a lot of work around these two models. We know a lot, and I'm very interested. I don't want to take up a lot of time. I know we have an agenda to see how we begin to implement. I left the conversation when we got to, and I didn't even know we got to this. I knew there was some conversation. I've been searching on my computer to see. I would love to see the model that we're using in the city. So there's several concerns here. And first, I cannot, because it just is burning in me, but you said, is it Philly and Smoot?
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
Philly and Smoot are somebody's children.
Yes, ma'am, they are.
And what we do, we did it in Wyland Park, Officer Meter, and you know, we did that. Those people that left here from what we label Short North Posse went somewhere else. They go somewhere else, and then the problem is in another neighborhood. And so what we learned from evaluating Boston ceasefire, and I sat with David Kennedy, you can look him up. He was the driver of the model that you're talking about. I just pulled it up. I was trying to look for the new version of this because this was going on 16 years ago, as we were saying community policing, wrapped in an ideal for my learned folks of broken windows theory. So you described so much of a broken window theory about a neighborhood that really set off these alarms in me.
Oh, this is not broken windows policing.
Well, I mean, that ideal of, so your presentation, and we, you know, I just want to get my thought out because I don't want to go far away from my point, so let me stay at my notes. The conditions that exist to get us to a broken window theory are conditions that were imposed upon the people that we are now policing. So let me say that. And so there is context to why West Side and Linden look like it does, and we have acknowledged, and Mayor and I have had these conversations, because we forgot those communities for a minute, and now we're here to go back and get them. But we did that in Wyland Park. We have an example. The Short North Posse boys that we still pull out, and the cousins and the kids that keep popping up and calling that name, the original ones was my family members and people that I love. And they went away, and some of them came home, didn't they, Aletha? And some of them are doing amazing things right now because somebody finally invested in saving them. So that rubs me the wrong way. Community policing, we got to get to, first of all, Boston ceasefire, and I'm going to try to wrap it up real quick and stay on my notes. Boston ceasefire and why we didn't decide to go that way at Ohio State, and correct me on pieces where I may have lost some sight, Officer Meter. Boston ceasefire uses the ideal that we can, if you pull it up on your computer, the definition of this model of problem solving, because we always have new names for the same thing. Problem solving, there is a problem, but it can't be addressed from just policing. So the problem exists in that, first, getting back to what was presented earlier, the humanness of those young people that we label, and then we move, like what we're doing now is gentrification all across the city that I love. Because when we decided to clean up a neighborhood, then people go push somewhere else. The people that left Poindexter Village are now out on Gender Road, displaced, causing problems, trying to find a new home. So, and that's a lot in that. We can't do it that way. Why I don't agree with this model of Boston ceasefire from David Kennedy, who I've sat with and studied with, that created this model you're presenting, and why I lean towards Cure Violence ceasefire or Dr. Gary Sluckins at the University of Cincinnati, is that ceasefire says that I make the choice, Tammy makes the choice to seek change. And we do the force you to change. So Boston ceasefire calls these young people in the room and I know what it does. I've talked to, and I don't see anybody from Mr. Klein's office here today, I don't think. We've had this deep conversation, Zach Klein and I, about this. You can't force people to change and make it be a real change. So if you build a case against me and put it up on the board and say I can choose door number 1 and go home today, because really that's what we do with this model. With these young people, I've sat in the rooms, Pastor Lamar and Cecil and all them are doing it now. And what happens, and because violence last year got so high, and I want y'all to know this as we study this problem. If you sit little Smoot and little Philly in a room and make them tell on Bobby and Billy, The street's gonna do some street justice stuff. And that's why this city last year got to the number of homicides we got to. I just wanna be real because I live in the street with these kids. You can't make a young person that don't have the ability to go back to their neighborhood, because right now I'm in a conversation with pastors saying those kids that we pull in off the street are scared to death because after they get through telling on their friends, they gotta go live in that neighborhood. And then the homicide rate rises. So there's a lot in it. I hope I covered the points. Let me just look at my notes real quick. I want us to get the change on this. I knew that we were implementing this way. Real change. Tammy Fournier outside of change because I knew I had to, and I made that choice. And a lot of times people tried to force me to stop smoking crack cocaine and going to prison. But until I decided for myself that I was going to change and choose and want it for myself, did that change take place? And my recovery came. And so I have a lot of problem with several of those things because gentrification in this city right now, you can't find a place. We are misplacing too many people. And so if you go into a neighborhood and target Lil Smoot and Billy and Philly and whoever it is, they got to go somewhere else. And then we've never solved the problem.
I think I heard something really different in terms of what you presented today. And I don't know how old Philly and Smoot are. I mean, they could be 18, they could be 50. But what I heard was that officers have had conversation with many individuals who live in the community. He didn't say he didn't say that there were teenagers who were snitching. They could be senior citizens, they could be others. They're the people who have to live in that community day in and day out. You work with community residents. Many times it can also be around a building, so you talk with the property management folks. The individuals who live in that community and want to stay in that community and who want to be safe in that community, we're able to help you identify at least 2 individuals who are criminals, and that they have been arrested and that they are now in the criminal justice system, that they are somewhere. But that for the people who live there, who want to feel safe, who want to be able to go to the corner and there is a food truck and be able to buy, they can do it. I agree with you, and we're going to have to try to think about what is. I certainly see gentrification, but I don't think that's what he was talking about today.
But let me respond. There's context, Chair Jackson, always. So again, I'm going to start with and keep bringing to the space that I've been doing this for several years now. So the surveys you spoke to and what you're trying to bring context to, and I respect that what you're saying, and I agree, I do. Many of us, Emily, and you were there, after a lot of these things to get us to this commission, so I know a lot about the surveys. What I know, now you can correct me and Officer Meade and others that represent police, what I found sitting with Kim Jacobs, because I met with her and Ned Pettis again and again, that on that first round of surveys in 2016 and 17, I have the report in my office. I'm going to finish.
I don't know what surveys you're talking about. I mean, because he's talking.
Let me give context and be heard and not leave from frustration, because I get frustrated quickly.
Well,
Listen.
You've had so much more experience, and you're talking about things that I don't think many of us know.
Rebuttal to me always.
No,
I've had to do my homework. Do the homework. I'm going to share it with you if you allow me to. So when we first got to this department, and I'm a little emotional, y'all, because Friday I got to go hold Tyree King's family, and y'all know Tyree King was killed. Friday will be the 2nd year anniversary, so I've been in that all day getting ready for the 2nd year anniversary of Tyree King. So I come in these spaces constantly with carrying stuff. After Tyree King was killed, we did surveys, Chief Jacobs, and we got them back. At that time in 2016 and 17, there were only 80. People don't just run up and talk to the police. Now, we're getting there, and I see it happening. People are beginning to feel more comfortable talking to police. I acknowledge that right now in this city. But when Tyree King was killed, people weren't there, and there were only 80 surveys. I have that. Okay, so our organization went and did deeper surveys, and many people in the mayor's office, and people are setting up and going and talking to people. We're getting places that we weren't, and we have to acknowledge that. Okay, so, and all of us can sit here and say we talk to people, but are we talking to those at the highest risk tertiary for my educated people? Are we reaching those at the highest risk, having conversations about gun violence? And this model was designed, and let's not lose sight of, to address gun violence. It wasn't designed to deal with nobody that's robbing nobody. This problem-solving oriented, look it up, I just looked it up to be sure before I say these things, was designed to address gun violence. Addressing gun violence from universities seeks to stop a killing. They ain't trying to fix crime and robbery. So they use this model, because if I can get you to come in and stop him from dying tomorrow, then I can use this model and it's effective. And so we're using a model that's used to address killings, to address low-level crime and nonviolence and drug selling and those other things. And that's where we miss these points, Chair Jackson. So we can paint blanket pictures if we want to, or we can narrow down, is this commission about addressing the relationship between community and police, which that's what I'm here to do, or we can try to do this in the context of, so we're addressing crime and drugs, and we got an opiate problem, we got a this problem, we got disproportionality here and there and everywhere, or we can focus in on what we're here to do. And the surveys, I know for a fact, I was with the chief and with Safety Director Ned Pettis, I know about these surveys. And we're doing them right now. I just left APDS doing surveys. That's the wave. We capture information and hopefully do the right thing with it.
Thank you. Is there any other questions from the commissioners on the presentation that was presented today? Again, I'd heard it before. And again, this particular approach was used starting in May in 3 communities,
Correct.
I believe. You're on the west side.
West Side.
There's also one in London,
Yeah, in
South London, and then
Parsons
around
Avenue.
the Parsons
Parsons
Avenue.
Avenue.
Will it continue beyond September?
No. It was temporarily funded through the mayor's office as an initiative. What they were doing is the mayor's office had allocated money to pay for overtime so that we could take these officers out, myself in particular, out of our regular assignment, dedicate us to this. And then 2 of the teams have already gone back to the regular assignments, and my team goes back on September 22nd.
Any questions?
Yeah, he answered my question with that.
Okay.
And then if, just clarify one other point, because I think it also speaks a little bit to this, because we have this discussion amongst my officers and myself. It's interesting because 2 individuals we're talking about, they're under 25. So when we start looking at that age development, that brain and stuff like that, we recognize we need to have a solution for young people under 25 because they're not making good decisions yet. So we see them as, man, we see them as human beings also. So I don't want that ever to get lost in this.
Certain people, I just need clarity. Like you
Yes.
said, certain people, certain people are more conditioned to crime. There's
No, not
research
conditions.
that's-
They have just a higher propensity towards antisocial
Where's that
behavior.
research coming from?
That's coming out of just about every major university out there. And it's not an assessment of anybody's individual value. What we need to do, and that's the other question, and we recognize in policing that there are certain problems we can't solve. This happens to be one of them. The approach that we take to it has to take that into consideration. All right, back to
research
so that's
that
where
says
that's where we're headed.
Yeah,
with
there's
that.
no research
we
that
recognize
says
they're
certain
individuals.
people are conditioned to crime. There's no research that says that. There's research. Black people and white people don't create crime or use drugs or are more violent or conditioned to violence at any higher rate than any other race of people. No, what happens is the conditions that we create causes them to be conditioned to be able to be in crime-ridden and use crime as an outlet, and most times it's an outlet or a resource or self-medication or whatever. Okay, it's conditions. So I just got to watch Antoine Fisher. If anybody has seen, remember that movie. Antoine Fisher was a movie about a black child that was given up for adoption, that was raised by some abusive people that wound up on a path to abuse. But then he joined the military. And Denzel Washington is in it. And the story goes, he goes back and finds his mother that gave him away, constantly trying to let him know he became a good man in spite of those conditions. So he wasn't birthed into being a criminal because of where he wound up being until he found somebody else to get him to the place he was destined to be. And so nobody is conditioned to crime. Nobody is birthed being a criminal. Violence is learned behavior, trauma, and all.
The officer said that.
He said certain people are conditioned to crime, and I need a definition of what he means by that. Because what's certain people?
What I heard was that the police got with the community and inquired and asked the community who are the troublemakers, who are the criminals in this neighborhood. And they told him, and those 2 individuals actually were committing gun crimes with robberies. In Dr. Kennedy's book. No, I did not hear that.
Excuse me. This is that you're born into.
I did not hear that.
For someone who sat on the bench for 10 years, and I will just say, let's say, and this is not a black-white thing, There were certain families. Now, the conditions could be that they lived in poverty. The conditions could be that there was domestic violence being on. The conditions in the household then led to children and others committing crimes. No one is saying that when you're born, when you're this little 8-pound whatever, you are automatically conditioned into. But where are you living? Who's having an influence on you? That's the conditioning. That's the conditioning, not by birth. And unfortunately, too many of our children are born into situations where that's what they see and experience every day. They themselves are victims of crime. So there has to be a reality around that. I mean, I could sit here and use family names from the West Side. And again, they were Caucasians, and there had been a history of criminal activity. Grandparents, parents, and then the next generation. So you can be conditioned by the circumstances in which you live unless you're moved from that. A couple of years ago, and I'll try to remember to bring this book the next time I come. He was actually a speaker here, and I think the name of it is The Other Wes Montgomery. So there are actually two gentlemen by the name of Wes Montgomery, kind of in the Baltimore area. They are African American, and eventually, I think it's Wes Montgomery. But I'll bring the book because I've read it and reread it. It's fascinating, and he was great. But just again, and I won't say by chance, but how the conditions, the influences in their life. One is in prison for the rest of his life. The other one was a gentleman who was here speaking, and so. Again, around the condition. Reverend, did you have a comment?
Yeah, well, and I hear everything that's been said, and it's all well and good, but, for me personally, as a black male, who is constantly stereotyped, when I hear somebody say certain people, I feel like that, and then when it's coming from a police officer, we're here because of how the relationship and how police communities of color. So I'm offended because I personally assume you're talking about me, people that look like me. So and you may not have meant that or meant anything by it, but understand how people like myself or Tammy or others are frustrated when we hear things like that, because we're always stereotyped, fall in the category of a certain this, and to hear that certain people, are more prone to violence or criminal activity, man, I was offended by it. That's why I immediately set up and wanted to ask the question. So,
and I understand certain people. So you've heard what the sergeant has said in terms of the work. So this is an opportunity where we could maybe help educate him. So if he was to share again the work that they did, and we would suggest, let's use another phrase other than saying certain people. What might that word or phrase be? Brooke?
So, and that's actually exactly what I was going to comment on, because the same moment that my colleagues are pointing out is the moment that my brain got stuck with what you had said, because I wrote it down too. Because I was going to ask, I was like, what exactly do you mean by certain people? Because what I know about research, and I know that a lot of people in this room are people who come with empirical backgrounds and understand kind of assessment and study and survey. And so really what it is that there are certain factors which increase your risk for involvement in the justice system. And it's not even that those factors mean you're going to be more prone to commit crime, as much as those factors mean that you are more likely to be in a place that if you do commit crime, you will get wrapped into the system. And so I think that using terminology like certain risk factors make it more likely that someone is going to end up in the system is a much more accurate and race-neutral terminology to use, because it triggered me, and it took me a minute to say, okay, let me listen to the whole story and hear what anecdote you're going to give to support it, because my initial thought was the same as Tammy's, sorry, I forgot your first name, but yeah, Jason, it was the same. And as somebody who works with young people in the justice system, it's important to know that language is important, and that because I can imagine Dr. Jones might have said, okay, hold on though, because that research, and what I know to be true about research as well is all about that risk factor, like certain things like poverty, certain things as trauma, access to medical care, like the list is long. Generational poverty, like there are things that definitely increase your risk to touch the system, but it's not even risk to commit more crimes as much as it is risk that the system will recognize some negative choice of yours and pull you in. Because there are kids who also have those same risk factors, but then there are other protective factors which keep them from getting drawn in. So I think risk factor is a much safer term to use that will not engender this response. Because, and not, Aletha, to pull you into it too, but I do think there's a commonality among those of us who may have experienced that stereotyping, that trigger resonated a lot quicker, and we were not necessarily in a position to see that as neutrally as Mr. Speaks would have.
And so I'm glad you pulled me in, though, because I think that the important lesson that we can take from this is that our law enforcement servants need to be open to our perspective, and that this then moves forward toward our training recommendations. Because at the end of the day, in a controlled environment like this where we have this visceral response, we can address it. But in the community, you don't really have the authority, like we talked about with Dr. Jones earlier, to address it in a way that will be received in the way that you hope. And so I think that it weighs in later on as a training thing that we need to make as a recommendation. And then our law enforcement officials need to be open to the idea that this can be more than criticism, but growth.
That's an excellent point. And I'm going to step in because we're going to have a hard stop today. In the timing, we must stop no later than 4:10, and we absolutely have some other items on the agenda that we need to get to today. I will say this: I thought this again was actually, I think, maybe one of the best examples of people sharing, how they were feeling, pushing back, and using it as a learning opportunity, not only for the sergeant, but others who are sitting in this room. Brooke, I want to thank you, sir, very much for sort of summarizing that, and even around the words that you were using around risk factors. And to Sergeant, to you, I'm sure that when you said certain people, you maybe didn't have any idea that's, as you said, that visceral, impact, but it was. So we all had a learning experience today, and I really appreciate that. Yes, Tim.
I'm going to let you move on, Chair Jackson, but in this, there has to be some balance. I cannot continue to sit in this position alone. So I need to be heard as much as everyone else. Unfortunately, I've been charged with this role. This is how I move through the world, so I'm okay with that. But I'm here, and I want to say to you, let me speak to you because you were up here in a hot seat presenting to us. Sergeant, thank you. It will take this. We've got to get, I just said at the break to this new gentleman I met earlier, we've got to get comfortable in the uncomfortableness of this very difficult conversation if we are going to ever get to the change we seek, really. And so, but in that, I've got and I'm getting old and my patience. I cannot sit here to try to give of myself in this commission meetings constantly okay? I don't have that many more dances to do, so I want to be able to get to a place where we are able to respect each other, and I will continue to remind myself to do that. And let me first say I'm coming from a place of caring, no disrespect to you. I say, and so many new people coming out of this room, my cousin, Officer Larry Wilson, detective, I think I don't know what he is right now because y'all have changed positions, but I have family in the police force, so it's not about that. It's about I want us to get to a place where we get to what we want to see in our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergeant. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. Do we have CPD updates? Oh, thank you, thank you.
I'm Deputy Chief Tim Becker. I'm the Deputy Chief over the investigative subdivision. Pretty much I have all of our investigators from homicide all the way down to narcotics and vice on the spectrum of seriousness of felony crimes. Just wanted to give a little update. You may or may not have seen, we had a press conference last week to announce we're having a pause in our vice operations. There's some information came to the attention of Chief Jacobs and I, probably post Stormy Daniels and then leading up to a shooting that just caused us to say we need to press the pause button, reevaluate some things. There are multiple investigations going on. Give those investigations some time to determine whether or not they're credible or not, and then move forward in a different direction with our vice operations. I can assure you they will not be moving forward as they were in the past. I can't tell you exactly what that path is going to be right now because we're in the midst of our research, but we will be moving forward differently, recognizing that one of the top complaints that we get is street prostitution, and that can't be ignored. And oftentimes bringing these, it's generally ladies, into the criminal justice system via the catch court is what helps break that cycle of prostitution. And we get a lot of letters from these ladies after they've got into that process thanking us, even though they resisted our arrest, fought us at the time of arrest, and were furious. Often they're opioid addicted. They realize when they go to jail, they're going to come down in jail, and it's going to be very unpleasant. And they do whatever they can to get out of going to jail. And but once they get through that cycle and realize that they have more worth than that and can turn their life around, they're very grateful for us for getting them into that system. So until society comes up with another mechanism, I mean, right now, one of the mechanisms to get that cycle broken is law enforcement enforcing the laws that exist. We will continue to do that, but it'll be done in somewhat of a different manner than we have done in the past. And there'll be more to come on that. That path hasn't been determined yet. But hopefully we'll have updates, or we'll have some idea which way we're going in the next month, and can start implementing things and retraining our officers here in late September, early October. Homicides are down a little bit this year, thankfully, violent crime, but we've been revamping how we do a lot of that, how we do our own internal investigations into that. So looking at every aspect of what we do, we can't control how much violence is on the street. At least my detectives can't. They investigate it after the fact. Sometimes how they control how much violence, though, is by taking the people off the street who are committing the violence. And we had only been solving less than 50% of our homicides last year, which means you can kill somebody and have a coin toss of getting away with it. To me, that's not acceptable. I like to use the term, if you've read the book Ghetto Side, that everybody know. And in the community, a lot of people know who's committing these homicides for one reason or another, where they're scared to tell us, or their fear of violence, they don't come forward. But not coming forward often leads to more violence as well, because these same perpetrators are preying on them one way or another. If they talk, they're threatened, or they're have violence come into their lives, and if they don't talk, the silence allows the violence to continue. So looking out for the community, I would like to be able to solve more of our homicide, but that truly is a community policing thing. There's very few homicides that occur with a serial type killer that's well thought out and planned, and they're wearing gloves, and the stuff you see in movies doesn't happen in real life. Most of our homicides are occurring in crowded spaces, and nobody's coming forward to give any information about it. We've had several this year, shootings where there's been 200-300 people present and not one person saw anything. So we know people saw stuff. It's till they get to that comfort level where they're willing to cooperate with the police And that's going to be a community policing effort. And if this committee has any ideas as you're producing your report that helps us get there, we're wide open to that. So that's just, I know we're running short on time. It's just an overview of some of the big things that have been going on. But while the homicide thing hasn't been very public, there's huge change going on in my shop on how we investigate felony crimes. And we're looking at things a lot differently. And those changes are going to continue to take place. But change in a big organization, I'm just one of 6 subdivisions or 6 deputy chiefs. But I have roughly 500 people. Getting those 500 people changing the culture, the paradigms, the physical locations, or moving desks is a big undertaking, and we're plodding forward with that.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing. Is there a question? Yes, Aaron.
So the work around the women engaged in prostitution, I know that you're doing some work there on how your department is engaging with them. Are you working with some of the task force and other community organizations in Columbus that work with these women a lot to help inform how that's happening?
Absolutely. I was in Judge Herbert's catch court last Friday with him and some of his social work people. Our vice unit has been moving this summer already towards what they started calling the city attorney's office, have been working with some of the community service organizations, and they were calling it the Linden model because we tested it in Linden. It's been expanded around the city. It's a model where we go out, our detectives often get, in a coordinated effort, get the elements on the females who are soliciting for prostitution. Absent them having warrants for their arrest, they don't go to jail that night. They are issued a summons, but they go back. There's social service workers there. They get a meal, which many of them hadn't had a meal in a while. They're quickly handed off to other people who do some engagement with them to try to find out to break this cycle, to encourage them to want to participate, to explain when they go to court that they're going to get talked about catch court and some options to go there. So it's not they're going to jail that night and they appear in arraignment court the next morning and they got to make a decision. It's trying to inform them on the options out there to see if they're in harm's way going back out. Some of them are being pimped out by other people and being forced into that lifestyle. I can't imagine there's ever been a female born or a male born, anybody who grew up thinking, I want to be a street prostitute, or even one that woke up this morning that did it yesterday that was excited about doing that again. And so finding a way to break that cycle. And so we have clergy's been involved, social service agencies have been involved. It truly has been a community effort. And one of my I gave a 30-point direction to my vice staff on what I wanted them to examine and develop going forward. But one of the 2 non-negotiables, one was that we continue to explore and expand those type of models that are community-driven, holistic models to go forward with that crime.
Certainly from the years of being on the bench, it has changed so much.
Oh, absolutely.
At least from when I was there. And it was even just a very short article, and I am not going to remember the name of this establishment. Most of us probably know of Dress for Success, where we donate our clothing for careers, but there's a particular retail store in town that's accepting clothing specifically for the women who are coming out of catch court. The article even said, if you can imagine how you maybe were arrested, they picked it in terms of what they were wearing. That is not something that you want them, leaving, with. It really just kind of caught my eye. So thank you, so much for that. Was there a question, Tammy?
I'm sorry, I'm missing Jenny. Are you your deputy chief? Jenny? Oh.
He's on the agenda.
I'm sorry, I know that, but my question is, are you over the vice squad, or what is your area of focus in the Columbus Police Department? I'm sorry.
I'm the deputy chief over the investigative subdivision, which includes vice. It includes pretty much all our detectives that investigate felony crimes.
Okay.
I'm just going to make one comment. I wonder if instead of using the word prostitute, if we use trafficking survivor, how that might change the perception? Just a comment.
At the end, some of it, the law is prostitution. So that's the legal code we're enforcing. So sometimes we can call things different things, but when it comes back to the law where we have to write our complaints or get people in the court, we have to use the legal terms. The police doesn't design the legal terms. The legislatures designs that, but so we can sometimes call it different things, but at the end of the day, what our complaints say and what the crime we're investigating is whatever crime is set forth by the legislature.
Let me just add real quick. So I've been spending some time with Donna's family, and I just want to drop this here real quick. The people that are out there on the streets that I've been talking to since Donna was killed and her family, they call themselves sex workers. And we have to acknowledge, and I love that you rooted it in the law, that we live in Ohio and there's a law around prostitution. But heck, if we're in Nevada, those are sex workers. And so I just wanted to bring that context.
So I heard you say that you're reiterating to your officers that you want to expand this type of intervention around this crime. Do you see the possibility of providing social service intervention for other types of felonies, like our nonviolent drug dealers who are arrested, and then also having them have the opportunity to have social service diversion that's not specifically centered around the court?
So some of it is we don't have the authority to, the diversion type stuff absent the court. This is in cooperation with the courts. So some cities do have drug courts and do have programs like that. We have some of that here. We try to look at, the different things. It's going to depend, a lot of things are going to depend what the voters say on the issue coming forth. It may change the whole world as we know it in terms of enforcing those type of drug offenses this fall. And that's up to the voters of our state going forward. But I can't say that we've necessarily looked at that type of model, because in the prostitution, it's ripe for that, in that at any given time, if I drive out on Sullivan Avenue by Pastor Ridley's establishment, within a few blocks of there, I can find a street prostitute, sex worker, whichever term we want to do. I can't necessarily drive out there and find multiple drug dealers, where to bring in the services of having the community, how much can the community effort, how much are they willing to come forward and volunteer their time, is a balancing act that we have to have as well. Because getting all those services together for one event it requires some great coordination and orchestration to get that done. And it's so the sex workers are out there en masse, and it's easier for that type of crime. It's also a misdemeanor crime versus some of the felony level crimes and where the drug sales are occurring and that type of stuff.
Thank you. I need to make an announcement around the committees, and we will need to adjourn. We can have other conversations. So at our last meeting, we named the 4 committees. They are hiring, training, 21st century policing, and hot topics. So again, your minutes will remind you of who both the chair and the vice chairs of those committees are. At the last meeting, we had roundtable discussions where each commissioner had the opportunity to go from table to say, within these 4 topics, we think you should look at this. And we're not prepared to give that information back to you yet. It will probably shape the work of the individual committees. But I also ask you to share with me the committees that you wanted to serve on, with number 1 being your first choice down to number 4. And for the most part, I've been able to grant those requests. So starting with hiring, Emily, Buster, and Aaron Sink will serve on that. Hot topics would be, Tiffany White. 21st century is Olitha Waugh. Training is Ellen Moore Griffin and Mary Wall. Tammy and Jason, I don't know if you need additional information on those committees before you might decide which one you want to serve on. The other thing is that we really believe that the topic needs to be covered in this session with all commissioners. So for example, with hiring, we've covered that. We've gone from the entire hiring process. So that committee can begin to make plans to meet and to move forward. Training is going to be covered at our next, on September the 25th, and again on the 18th. And so we would want for those two sessions to be covered with all commissioners before, Brooke, that committee would actually meet. Hot topics, we're going to cover in early December. And on that one, even though, again, we've listed the actual committee, that absolutely could be one where we'll post when those meetings are going to take place, because there might be much interest of all the commissioners to stop in to hear as much as they can. And then, of course, 21st century, we're going to have, we've heard about that today, we'll hear more. And as you look at this tentative schedule, realize that Matrix is going to be, we're going to be introduced to Matrix. We're going to prep for it on September 25th. We'll be meeting them on October the 18th. But if you drop down looking in early, March, April, that's when we anticipate that the committees will be making their recommendations to Matrix and all, getting them ready to go to the mayor. So any questions about that process?
So there are 3 committees.
There are
right?
4 committees.
4 committees, okay, so, 1, 2, okay, in this hot time. And I see here in the minutes from the last meeting that there are chairs and vice chairs of the 4 committees.
Yes.
How did we get to the chairs?
I appointed the chairs.
All righty then. And I just want clarity about, was your decisions made on your feeling like these folks have expertise in these? How did you reach that
I'm not sure
decision?
that any of us have the complete expertise in all areas. I felt that with either interests that have been expressed or the backgrounds that I know of, they would be the right persons to lead.
Okay. And was that okay with the other commissioners who could be done to follow up?
I haven't heard any objections.
Is that an open conversation? Is that I don't know. I don't know, because I didn't know if I was trying to read the minutes, was there a conversation we collectively in this commission decided we needed these folks to lead in these areas, or?
As the person appointed by the mayor to lead this commission, and within my discretion, I made those decisions. I do understand that it was the right thing for you to do, to have 6 weeks to focus on your care, but we've not been standing still. We have been going forward and having meetings.
I feel like
no,
this place of back and forth that I can't exist in.
And again, I would love to have a conversation, or you could have with Elon around where.
Finish, please.
Excuse me. You're interrupting me. I'm simply saying that we absolutely want to have conversations to help bring you up to date or to give you additional information on all of these topics. Yes, what would you like to say?
So I thought we were having a conversation. I'm sorry. So I thought we were back and forthing again, but let me just be clear how you want me to communicate with you. They are directly affected by people, by these systems that we are addressing, that I would suggest, and I don't need to be, I got enough commissions, I sit in enough seats, I'm not saying for my personal self, I am not offering up to this committee to chair anything, but I would like to see people that have been directly affected to chair a committee or be a vice. So I would offer up a black male that, I know Jason is gone, and I don't see Aletha as chairing or vice chairing on any of these, but I think Aletha, because he does that direct work right now at the Urban League, I would suggest that we look at a vice chair that is more closely connected to the community policing we're trying to get to, and someone else that has been affected by the system is my offer up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you. And I hate to rush, but I have to do something in 4:15. And so again, thank you for your involvement today. We're going to be adjourned. We'll see you at our next meeting with some communications in between.